Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show. He's Rick Dodson and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, can you voluntarily accept laws? Tim.
The longer title is, of course, or are laws foisted upon people involuntarily? If I sit down and play, let's say, a game of chess with a family member or online, I agree to the rules of the chess in a way which one normally uses the words voluntary. No one's putting in my gun to my head. I can free to leave. I'm free. There's other versions of chess. There's freestyle chess. And the punishments or penalties for breaking the rules of the game are fairly limited. No one's going to send me to jail or anything like that if I move the bishop, like a rook, or I move the queen like a knight. No one's going to punish me. And of course, there's other variants, as I just stated, freestyle and so forth. And in those games, the players voluntarily accept the rules in advance. The players could choose not to go. They could choose not to go to tournaments. This is true for all quote unquote games, especially games played professionally or games played competitively. As I tell some of my nieces or nephews, there's no point in playing a game if you change the rules 3/4 of the way through just to allow you to win. Why even play? It's not really a game. You're just moving pieces around like a 2-year-old moves pieces around. If I go to an MLB game or any sporting game, typically they have terms and conditions on the tickets. And you're not allowed to curse at other fans, various codes of conduct. And again, you could voluntarily say no thanks. I'm not really interested in having a discussion right now specifically about just loan ownership of property. Does the team justly own the property? And does the or if I stay in a hotel, typically you agree not to smoke weed or make loud music and so forth. These rules seem relatively voluntarily if you assume private property that is, you can go to different hotels. You don't have to go to the stadium. You don't have to play chess. You don't have to do any of these things. You could do otherwise. The punishments or penalties are very low. So the point I'm driving at here is that these rules you can agree to voluntarily, and you can also agree not to play the game and not to go to the hotel. So, but the rules of quote unquote society or the rules of quote unquote the state, and I'm using quote unquote just to name them in a way in which different people could refer to them somewhat differently. I don't think you actually can agree not to follow, let's say, the rule of murder being wrong. We did a very old episode on is murder wrong. It's one of my favorite episodes we've done because to me, there is a certain sense in which that rule is just kind of foisted upon people. Now there are ways you can try to argue that it is quote unquote not foisted upon you. Maybe Walter Block would try to do this, but you don't seem to have an easy way out if you think murder isn't wrong. You don't seem to have easy way out if you don't think that property is unjustly acquired or is property itself is unjust. Now, people like Kinsella or Rothbard might get into sort of, I'm going to use this term loosely, autistic argument over because you are talking, and this is the Hoppian argument, because you're talking, you're just assuming property, you're just assuming argumentation and so forth. And so these are some of the tricky ways, and Habermas has the same thing, but Habermas, of course, vis-a-vis argumentation ethics, infers, liberal democracy. That to me is more of a stretch in some sense. But to repeat, the rules of the games, you can always play different games. You can agree not to play the games. The rules of hotels or stadiums, you could go to different stadiums, hotels. But if if it's 1990 and I want to do weed, it's possible that I'm going to jail. If I'm in the United States or if I'm in Japan or Singapore, I can't opt out of the rule against, weed, for example. I don't smoke weed, FYI. I'm just saying that's the thing. That's a rule that you can't opt out of. Now, if you say, well, if I travel to Saudi Arabia, do I agree not to drink alcohol? Maybe. That may be the case. So, tourists going to a place, when they enter the country, de facto agree to the new laws. If I go to Canada, I'm not allowed to bring weapons or even pepper spray into Canada. If you're out bicycling in the woods, it's very, it's one of the ways in which gun control de facto makes everyone worse off. But and I'm under no illusion that the United States is slowly being piecemeal. I'm not doing this to say rah 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 America, although we do probably have some of the most liberal gun laws in the quote unquote developed world. Anyway, but you don't agree to these rules, and one of the principal ways we don't agree to these rules is the state shoves them down your throat, and in some cases literally shoves you down your throat. DUI checkpoints. If you just want to travel around in normal fashion, you need to obey the rules. You can't just drive a car on the roads. Now, there are tricky ways out of this. So let's say you have a license, and when you get your license, you agree to follow the rules. But the only way a license actually works is the state controls all sorts of choke points: the manufacturing of cars, the regulation of cars, the insurance of cars, the roads themselves, and even the police. It's de facto a crime in most countries to run away from the police if they have reason to get you. And even if they don't have reason to get you, in places like Australia, you don't really have any rights to not talk to the police if the police want to talk to you. So in a very real sense, some of the ways in which some people try to get around the involuntariness of certain laws is only possible because the state controls all sorts of, choke points and apparatus. So I think one of the maneuvers that typically is made is this fiction of a social contract, i.e., by living there, you agree to it. Libertarians are correct to dismiss this, but the problem to me is if you get to Ancapistan or some sort of freed market or some sort of Kevin Carson-istan or a private law society, as Hoppe would call, it seems like the rules themselves are probably going to be foisted upon people, in particular outsiders, but even domestically amongst the people the long-term residents, so to speak, of there. It seems like the rules themselves are just going to be foisted upon them without, you can't really opt out of it. When we did our episode with Rick's story about grammar, it's odd. Rick made the point that in some sense, grammar is rules that are there's no well, the French language is a little different. Most languages are there's the rules of grammar, and you can break the rules of grammar. People might not understand you. But again, there's not much for punishment for breaking the rules of grammar, like there is shooting a politician or shooting someone that is of a protected class. Now, of course, someone might say, well, murders don't always get solved, therefore you are allowed to murder. That's kind of true. But there is at least, in theory, an attempt to make people bow to the law, so to speak. So my question here for you, Swithin, is: are laws are you free to opt out of laws? And to go more deeper into this, in whatever you want to call some sort of stateless society, would you be free to opt out of these laws, or are these laws in some sense involuntarily? Isn't that some of the ways in which society is just? I mean, the statists might just argue that this is why you need a state, and very smart statists, like the minarchists and the classical liberals, will just make this point. I think it's the purest point in favor of their point. So, Swithin, what do you make of this discussion so far? What are your thoughts, and can you voluntarily opt out of laws?
Well, the short answer is no, but that's a more interesting answer. So, I mean, in your example with games and stuff, and do you agree to follow the laws? Well, in a sense, you do, but I mean, you could make the case that even rules of games that you don't agree to them, in the sense that maybe you thought this game was good and you thought the rules were a good set of rules, but then when you were playing it, you're like, these rules suck, these rules are bad, I don't like these rules, I want to do something else. And then they go, but you can't do this because the rule says, because the rules of the game is this. And it's like, well, okay. So, I mean, you could always argue that anything is foisted upon you insofar as you, at any given point in time, don't want to do that thing. And then to the extent that there's some sort of sanction on you doing that, then it's kind of foisted. Maybe it's not foisted. Your past self, as it were, is binding your present self. But I mean, yeah, that's a very sort of inconsequential example. But it is relevant though, things like contract law, because you could say, well, I agreed to trade at this, but it's like, well, I now think it was a bad idea to make an agreement to trade in 6 months. It's like, well, why should I be bound by that? Because, well, even though I agreed to it then, but that doesn't mean I agreed to it now. So even under contract law, these things are kind of foisted on you. However, you do have much more control over, and this is what you were getting at with the various choices and like locations of hotels and things. When it comes to things like contract law and like business to business transactions, you do tend to have a reasonable amount of options because you can decide. Now, of course, there's always the argument, well, if you don't have many people you can trade with, etc., and there's more power and like one business than another, yeah, fair enough. But the real interesting cases are going to be things like tort law and criminal law, because the whole point with tort and criminal law is you don't have a prior existing contractual relation with anybody. And then the question is, well, okay, someone has an objection against something you've done. Well, okay, well, how should we proceed with this? And when it comes to sort of laws, I mean, it'd be interesting in this case to determine what a law is. It's kind of difficult to define. It's almost like a socially sanctioned. If you break a law, there's sort of social sanction to treat you in a radically different way than it would normally be okay to treat most people. That effectively is what a law, well, that's a punishment from a law amounts to, which then kind of, at least when it comes to, you know, how the legal system will deal with you, it just means that they can deal with you in a radically different way than you would normally be able to deal with people. Like you can take their stuff or you can put them in a box or something, which typically most people can't do to regular people. Where am I going with this? So that's a law. So then the interesting question, so supposing you get Ancapistan, and then, you know, do you agree to the criminal law? Well, you could say, well, if you had microstates, or well, you don't have states because it's Ancapistan, but maybe you have a plurality of different sort of political non-state communities, and they're really small, and the costs of exit are really low, then you can argue that to some extent that you can choose the legal code in which you operate. However, then you do get the issue of, well, okay, let's suppose there's a dispute between people in different political communities. Then the question is, well, okay, well, which law is going to be followed? And, you know, you're going to end up whereby someone's going to be forced against his will to do something. I mean, when you go to, for instance, if someone agrees to go to arbitration, but it goes against him and he's like put in a box or he's fined or something, I mean, he doesn't really want that things to happen to him, even though he's agreed that, okay, this judge is okay. Well, he's the best guy we've got, but I lost. I mean, that's kind of binding his will in a much sort of stronger sense than it is that you're playing chess and decide, actually, the rules are bad. We shouldn't be allowed to do this. I don't see there's no real way. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any real way of not foisting laws upon anybody, unless you say, well, the only thing society should do is they should be able to do things like boycott you or refuse to trade with you or something like that. And this sort of like collective coordinated action of the community is sort of still like what people would normally be able to do to anybody, but you've just sort of banded together to do it to you. Then I suppose, though, then you're going to make a distinction between things like positive and negative liberty. It's like, okay, you haven't infringed directly on anybody's rights per se, but then you could go, well, it's going to be extremely difficult for this guy to actually even buy any food, so he's going to starve and die. Let's assume that all land is owned at this point, and you can legitimately go on somebody else's land. And so, even though, okay, maybe his rights defined in sort of negative liberty terms aren't actually violated, he's kind of still having things going against his will in that case. So even in that sort of least aggressive in certain respects of legal system, you're going to have laws forced on you. I think the question is how and who is really what the most important questions are here.
I think there's basically two, if not three. There's really only two capital C crimes. One is murder, and the other is physical property crime. I say physical property crime. I should add physical property crime of physical property theft of justly acquired physical property. So, and Kinsella might try to say, that's Kinsella of the libertarian Kinsella, would say that that actually murder is a kind of property crime. So and a second point I have to make is I think it's hard to divorce ethics / morality from laws / the legal system. Because if you ask people why is murder wrong or why is theft wrong, you say, well, it harms people, or it harms things, or things that were appointed to you are no longer appointed to you. If you get into Proudhon, like Proudhon tries to argue that property is theft because this is something that was either in the public domain or someone else's domain that's now been privatized to you. So it's taking it away from everyone else. So you have to ask the question: why is killing that person, or why is taking that out of the public domain or taking it out of someone else's domain into your domain wrong? Well, it kind of just is. And this is where you quickly get into philosophy and or theology, or like very thick forms of sociology / philosophy, like, well, it just is, or, well, God or society commands it such. That's why murder is wrong. That's why it harms people. So I think in this sense, individualism runs up against, I'm going to call it collectivism, but I'm not using this in the pejorative sense. Individuals come from communities. And if we talk to someone like Rick Story, who'd make this point, or you talk to someone like Alasdair MacIntyre, they make this point. Individuals don't just exist in vacuums, they exist in communities. So what we're really talking about is communities. And communities, for it to be not just an ersatz community, but actually like a community that reproduces itself, probably has to have certain factors. And certain rules. So, like, this is where one of the ways in which you can get at murder being wrong and you agreeing to it is the sense that, well, if you were allowed to murder people as if, at willy-nilly, so to speak, then in some sense, fewer people would exist or no one would exist. And that would be bad. Bad in the sense that if the community continues to exist, it has to follow these rules, at least internally. We can deal with outsiders later, but at least internally, the family just got smaller. If you imagine, Robinson Crusoe, maybe not alone on an island, but let's just say your family and Rick's family were marooned on an island. You killed Rick because you got into an argument with him. Now there's one less person. That would be bad. That would be bad for the life of the community in the sense that you're significantly weaker in that regard. So in this, you can sort of like reason up that this is why murder is wrong, using certain. You can try to get out of the sort of strict, like, moral theism or the moral nihilism, which is the flip side of like divine moral command theory. Again, I find it very hard to divorce the why. I find it very hard to divorce the ethics / morality from the laws and legal system. Because if you bang on people, you bang on philosophers or legal theorists' heads, why shouldn't I be able to steal that thing? Why shouldn't I be able to shoot that person? They almost have to appeal to something thicker. So this is where it gets into the sort of community order. Now so the question is anarchism a theory of communities relating to one another, or a theory of individuals relating to one another? Political scientists will actually say, and this is, I took political science courses, that the international system is anarchic. So if you ask someone like Mises, or you ask someone like the common liberal, especially starting in the 1950s, they want the United Nations to be a kind of one world government that has actual legal powers to sanction, let's say United States, or let's say Russia. They want to sanction, they want to have a thing. But in practice, the international legal system is anarchic. So it's just like, well, the US gets to, do whatever up to a point. Iran gets to do whatever, or Russia gets to do whatever up to a point. We had a discussion on nuclear weapons and the Nuclear Weapons Non-Proliferation Treaty. Many states like India, it was India or Pakistan, number of states didn't sign it. I don't think Israel signed it either. So, oddly enough, Iran did sign it. But these states agreed that the states that weren't party to it would just argue, well, why would I agree to these rules? I don't, but in some sense you can make it, it's the old mafia lie. I'm gonna make an offer you cannot refuse. So this is in some sense a way in which the domestic scene mirrors the international scene very much so. Like during COVID, you could argue, like in places like Australia, you couldn't go out in certain cities because the state just mandated you couldn't, and it's used their power of their guns and their sort of media and moral apparatus to sanction you, so to speak. So you have individuals, you have communities, and you have states. I think like the purest form of anarchism would be just individuals relating to individuals. The problem with this is most people don't exist as individuals. And then the secondary form would be communities that are relating to communities. So the real question for like a free market anarchist or an Capistan or a private law society would be, how can you meaningfully get people to agree to these laws without like either becoming a state or becoming an organization that's almost like a state? And again, there's a weird way in which like it would be silly to say that everyone, if no one leaves Britain in the next 30 minutes, everyone agrees to every single law that's passed. That would be like a silly. You could concoct a scheme in which you can have like a phony agreement. Like I think they used to have mass baptisms in certain regimes, or not mass baptisms, but like you have mass initiation procedures. Like you come up with phony things. So I'm not really interested in like a words level dispute over like what means consent. We've already done episodes on consent. And this is not but that's my line of questioning. I'd like to go here, Swithin. Like, what would be a meaningful way to get people to quote unquote agree to laws? And in the future, if they break those laws, like your points about contract law are interesting in the sense your future self, your past self is binding your future self to these rules, especially if in the future self you're no longer explicitly advantaged to those rules. So, Swithin, what do you make of this?
So if you wanted to have a situation where people sort of chose the rules, then the closest situation you're going to be able to get to that is going to be a situation where there's lots of different political communities that you can easily go to. The costs of leaving are low, and these communities have sort of reasonably different legal codes. Because if it was true that all these political communities happened to have the same legal code, well, then that'd be a problem, because you wouldn't be able to choose it. Because you can choose any one of these, but they're all the same. So yeah, I mean, that's an issue. But then the question, I suppose, is for what reason might you want people to choose what laws they sat under? Because I suppose this might be Mises' point. It's like, well, suppose we know what the best laws are. Well, surely if we know what the best laws are, that what we should do is then have all these best laws everywhere. And then, well, the best way to achieve this is to have one world state to enforce it everywhere. Which, I mean, is sort of makes sense to some extent as to why you might think that way. Now, the problem with that is, well, even if the point way I would go is, well, even if the world state had the sort of like the right laws, and you know what they are to begin with, when there's no particular reason to expect why they would keep them. And why not just change them into their own for their own advantage? Which is where having been able at least to move between, even if they have very similar law codes, but it would at least the fact that you could leave might then provide some form of constraint on whoever is the states or elites and whatever you want to call them in those areas to sort of do some things that are kind of slightly less obviously just in their own interest. Now, it's interesting you mentioned state and state-like entities. So this then begs the question of what is the state? And you said you don't want to get into word games, but then, it's actually quite difficult to, I'll do my best to define what a state is, because often if you come across definitions of states, it always uses the word monopoly. Max Weber, I think, is a monopoly on violence. Hopper is, well, he says the final decision maker, although again, it's not immediately obvious what the final decision maker means. Other ones is like monopoly on law. I think Hopper has used that. Then the question is, well, what is a monopoly? If you look at Rothbard's view of monopoly, monopoly doesn't mean having 100% of the market, because as Rothbard rightly notes, I have 100% market share on my labor services. Is that bad? No. And if you happen to be better than everybody else in a particular market such that you have 100% of the market, is that a problem? To which answer is no. So for Rothbard, monopoly is a legal privilege. So then the question is, well, okay, how are we then going to define kind of what a state is? If it's just a monopoly, it's a legal privilege, but it's like, well, monopoly of law, but law is, it's like, what's a legal privilege? It isn't law. So a while ago, I came up with this sort of taxonomy of law and order. And you could distinguish between 5 phases of it. And there is one, or part of one of them, which I think is where the state really is. So what you can have with law and order, like services, you have prevention, and there's obviously loads of different people who can help in prevention and security. There's investigation, so there's an offence, or there's a claim, there's an offence, and you can find out what happened. And clearly we can still have a state and have all those things taking place. Then if there's 2 parties that are in disagreement, you can have mediation, and there's clearly loads of state mediation services, and the state doesn't really do any mediation. The possible in the UK of ACAS, which is to do with workplace disputes. Then you have the last 2. You have arbitration and you have punishment. So arbitration is just going, okay, well, we have a dispute. We're going to, someone has a dispute, and then someone decides what happens to either or both or none of the parties. And you can then split this into 3 with arbitration, what the law should be, the trial, and then what the appropriate punishment would be, or the remedy or whatever. So it seems to me that the state is, if we're going to find monopoly on law, it is in that section. And so the question then is, do we locate that in the fact that it creates it creates law, or well, maybe not creates the wrong term, because you say it's discovered, but is the monopoly in the fact that the particular law that they sort of use? Because if that was the case, that seems to me to be quite similar to well, if everybody just decides for whatever reason that they want to use a particular law code, that doesn't seem to necessarily imply that that's a state thing. Certainly not a modern state thing, because it existed before. But in Gideon Hopper's position, he says that you have to go to him for arbitration as a final decision. It seems to me that the state, the essence of the state is it decides that it's the only person that's allowed to adjudicate in a particular legal case. So I think I've defined it in the past that you have sort of like 5 people to have a state. You have 2 people who have a dispute. They want to go to a third party, but a fourth party says, no, you're not allowed to, you have to come to me. And the fifth person says, yes, you should go to the fourth person, because that gives some sense of legitimacy to the fourth. Because the idea of the state is it has some sort of social legitimacy. And that, I would say, in Embrace, that wouldn't be a very strong state, and you could probably ignore it quite easily. But it seems to me that the monopoly of arbitration, rather than the monopoly on arbitration, like preventing people from providing services, is the locus of state, rather than just what the law is. Because as we pointed out, society to function is going to need laws anyway, and you have that choice to some extent over what the laws could be if you had sort of like if you had lots of microstates or an Ancapistan, you would have some control, but you would still have these. And if someone had an offense and you didn't think that, I don't know, taking his car was wrong, well, then that's going to be sort of enforced against your will. And Rothbard, I think, is pretty clear on this. I mean, he's like, no, you have to follow libertarian ethics. And so, if in Rothbardistan, the law code is the ethics of liberty. And insofar as Rothbard doesn't think that he's a statist, then I don't think we can locate the state there. And so it's sort of, as I say, the monopoly of arbitration, which thereafter then goes, well, if you're the only one who go to for arbitration, they can then go, well, we're just going to change what law we follow on, and we're going to change things in our interest. And, oh, well, look, we can now take stuff from people, etc. And then it goes from there. So that's sort of what I would say a state is. Now, then you could say, well, what's a state-like institution? Well, I suppose it depends on how expansive your definition of state is. But that's the way I would sort of look at this. So so in theory, I would say you could have a position where I think this inside, it's consistent with Rothbard. If you have World Rothbardistan, and you have, but everyone follows the ethics of liberty, but you've got free competition in judicial services, then there is no state. Unless you want to take a different view of Rothbard, which is perfectly fine. I'm not saying you couldn't. I do in various points. But that's just the way I would think about things.
The question is I guess there's 2 questions. Can you agree to the future about your past self, or are laws themselves in some sense just like there in time, outside of time, universally? I think we were having a message discussion, and we got to the point where I think for libertarianism to be true universally, it has to be true universally. It has to be true for all societies, all peoples, at all times, not just for certain groups at certain times, which solves the sort of time problem for your future and past self. If the contract is just and you sign the contract, then you should agree to the contract in the future. So, like when I play a game and I'm suddenly losing, if I agreed, like I think it would be silly for me to change the way a rook would move just so I could win. That would, in some sense, invalidate the game. Or if, like, if poker was being played in such a way, I don't actually know how to play poker, so I didn't use the example. But if you get to the game where the payout now is different, then that's like, if laws are universal, then they should just be that. Then you should agree to them. Socrates, more or less, to me takes the most purest position in this sense. Like, Socrates voluntarily takes the hemlock in some strange sense. I mean, he is coerced, I guess, but he voluntarily does it. Now, I would argue he's an Athenian national, and he's to some extent, not the term didn't exist, but martyring himself, or honorary death in a way. Now, if I, like for example, during the J Sixers trials, like they, and you might think, what's the example? What's the relation here and there? Well, here's the relation. Oftentimes, for one thing, none of them. I'll back off from that example right now. Go back to Socrates. Socrates agrees to take the hemlock. I think for Rothbardistan to work in this sense, in some sense, people have to, on an ideological level or sort of a thought level or a theological level or some level, like either consciously or at least some people, we call them the elites, agree to these rules and agree to enforce these rules through coercion in some sense. Like one of the ways to think about this is are you allowed to let's say hide a thief in your house? Now this showed up in the lead up to the U.S. Civil War, for example. Like one of the cases against the Hoppian and the Thomas Lorenzo viewpoint on the American Civil War is that Southerners didn't like the fact that Northerners were allowing their property, who they viewed as people, to flee, and they were, aiding and abetting the. I mean, this is the Southerners' point of view, aiding and abetting the theft of property. Now, for the Northerners' view, they were aiding and abetting humans. So we have a disagreement over what the status of that thing here. So in this regard, the Northerners would be, this is the Fugitive Slave Act, which was like the thing that probably guaranteed the Civil War. They viewed it like, well, you can't actually sanction the rules. Now, Immanuel Kant, for example, has his Universal Declaration Against Lying. So, in this regard, if a slave catcher comes to your door, you ask him, "Do you have a slave?" You'd have to say yes, but you would try to say, "Well, this law is unjust." So, to me, the tricky thing about to me for minarchists in particular, but also leftists, is oftentimes they're being somewhat duplicitous about what they actually view as breaking the law. So if you're defining breaking the law as breaking some sort of like procedural or some sort of unjust law, then really, and this is Socrates, really it is just and necessary to break an unjust law. An unjust law is itself like a four-sided triangle. They shouldn't exist. So, like, once you get rid of all the unjust laws and unjust enforcement of unjust laws, then really you just have pure justice, and everyone should voluntarily consent and assent to pure justice. So, if that's what Rothbardistan is, then, like, I think Proudhon and Marx would actually agree in this sense, and Locke and everyone would actually agree to the, like, pure justice. I mean, maybe this is more of a theological point, but like if you consciously did something wrong and knowingly did so, and like and that's what the legal system does, then I think there might be a way in which people agree to that. Now, of course, the problem is humans. My anarchism is rooted, oddly enough, for some, in my conservatism, in the sense I don't think there is a class of guardians, or definitely not politicians, a la the Why the Worst scale on top. And just because you elect them doesn't make them any different. And this is what Hoppe would argue in the errors of classical liberalism, which to me is Hoppe's best work, is my anarchism is rooted in my conservatism, in the sense that I don't trust a group of people, especially people who are, power-hungry psychos, Lindsey Graham or Keir Starmer, to justly enforce or justly interpret or justly create just laws. I don't trust any of those groups. The David Friedman line is that like, if the way we produce the best restaurants, the way we produce the best bikes or the best pool tables or the best athletes is we have voluntary exchanges. We do have property rules, but we kind of like just, in a sense, the pricing system is an argument in some sense. Like, you think that's worth 20, I think that's worth 10. Let's agree to 15. So can we get laws in the same way? I think potentially. I think it's possible. I don't think we're going to get just laws if we elect lunatics and psychopaths at the ballot box to have an agency known as the state, which involuntarily taxes us by normal, and so forth, and then can enforce and rule on its will. I'm sure certain states and certain criminal gangs, aka states, are a little more closer to pure justice, if pure justice exists, than other ones. But that's not an argument. That's the old Walter Block lie. One master beats you 100 times, the other master beats you 10 times, and gives you at least a chance to explain yourself. Obviously, you're going to pick the one that does 10 times. But that's not much of a choice there. So my view is that if laws are like in this, but if laws are just like arbitrary and local, then Rothbardistan can exist, but it will exist as a local phenomena. And outsiders, and to some extent some amount of insiders, might not voluntarily agree to these laws. If I'd ask the centrists during COVID about the COVID laws, they would say, I voluntarily wear a mask. I voluntarily got vaccinated. I voluntarily pay my taxes. There's a bread tuber who said I think it's that paying taxes is a religious experience for him, because I just think about the people it helps. I mean, again, you could argue that in some sense the modern day state is voluntary by some weird, caveat in that sense. So that's my long aside, Swithin, on your answer here. I think if pure justice exists in this fashion, then I do think people will voluntarily assent and consent to it automatically, and they would line up to it. I mean, just like Socrates does. Socrates voluntarily did that, but I would argue Socrates did so only on the grounds that he was making an appeal to a higher law, which is to some extent what libertarians, I think, are doing. But then the question is, does such a higher law or natural law or law above, individual times and places actually exist? And how do you enforce that? I don't know. I don't have a clear answers, but I do know that electing lunatics and psychopaths a la Hayek, why the worst get in top, doesn't seem like a good answer. Now, maybe Hobbes is right and the alternative is just like a war of all against all. But in the current existing society, we have a war of all against all. It's called how states, and even the federal government in the United States sometimes goes to war with other aspects of the federal government. So there isn't a unitary theory of the federal government. I mean, actually, oddly enough, that's how oftentimes we get liberty. Maine might make weed illegal. Utah might make gay marriage or prostitution legal. It's like various states will do different things. So even there, it's not a unitary theory. Mises, oddly enough, thinks we need a unitary theory. But then again, Mises is a pure thinker. I respect that. So Swithin, what do you make of this pure justice ideal?
It seems to me perfectly possible that pure justice could exist, but people, for whatever reason, don't accept it. They could do it just because it's not in their interest or just because they're somewhat ignorant. So I don't think that if pure justice existed, that everybody would necessarily agree to it. But when it comes to any body of law, you're going to have people who, in any situation, that things are going to happen against your will. Sorry, another thing is, then the question is, well, okay, well, which laws are going to exist? Well, it seems to me that their law as such is always going to exist. The question is, how is it formed? And by law, again, here, I just mean in a practical sense, something that if you break, people can treat you radically differently than you would otherwise be able to. And it seems to me that historically, kind of, if you like, tribal situations, you've had sort of the authority seems to be like the patriarch of the tribe, etc. And you have always had sort of authorities that people will look to, and they will change their sort of behavior, at least to some extent, accordingly. So if you look at, is this Christopher Lash? I can't remember. There was a book, and I can't remember what it's called, which is bad. But in the he charts in the 1960s that and charts public perception of whether segregation was a good or a bad thing, and basically shows that people's position on whether segregation is a good or a bad thing flipped when segregation was abolished. The people just sort of followed whatever was told to them, because people follow authorities. It's just what they do. So when you're in any sort of political community, there are going to be a group of people somehow who are going to determine the content of the law, which we could refer to as, if you want to use the term, governing elites. The question is who and what law are they going to produce? But I think this is going to exist in basically all societies, and it's not something that is peculiar to the state. As I said, I think the thing that's peculiar to the state is we've got these bodies of law, but then only people we let you go to is allowed to dispense a ruling that is socially sanctioned. Because what you might think is, well, you've got the rules of the game, that's fine. It's a common set of rules, and then you can kind of just enforce it. And if someone's followed the procedure and whatever and go, he's guilty, then okay, society would accept that as a legitimate thing. Because one of the functions of law is not just going to be between the two parties, but it's to show third parties that what has taken place is just, or at least by the standards of the community. Because third parties want legal certainty, because this is the way that you can function well in a society, is to know what's the law and what's not, and how they. Because the thing is, if third parties didn't know that Mr. X was genuinely guilty, if they see like a punishment agency doling out, corporal punishment to him, they'd be like, hang on, isn't the punishment agency the one who is actually breaking the law? Because unless the other guy had legitimately broken the law and had a just ruling against him, then actually the person committing the crime is the punishment agency, in a way that you could say, well, actually it's the prison off guards who are actually criminals, because they are imprisoning people who are not guilty of crimes that should not be crimes. Are guilty of, they might be guilty of crimes of particular laws, but these laws shouldn't exist. I might have garbled that, but yeah, so I don't think if there's pure justice that everyone would necessarily have to follow it for various would choose to necessarily follow it. And in any community, you're going to have people who decide what the content of the law is. And this is and this is true in Rothbardistan. Rothbards, the interpreters of Rothbard will determine what the content of the law is. And this is just what will happen. And it's how you could do it. This is why I think a hereditary system is probably better, because you're not encouraging people to do it just because they want to make the laws, because they just happen to do it because they're hereditary. Now, the question is, well, how did they get there to begin with? Maybe they were in sort of like a state system. They sort of raped and pillaged and became de facto leader. And so then, to the extent that personality is heritable, etc., then there might be more likely to be tyrannical than the average person. It's possible. But I think, just as a general point, hereditary things are at least are going to put up more random results and not have somebody who is just power hungry going to it. Because if you have elections for determining the content of the law, you're just going to get people who just want to change it, and probably people who want to micromanage people is probably what you're going to get. So yeah, that's the way I'd approach it.
Exit. The principle of like the market seems to be exit. Whether you're a producer or a consumer, is you're free to shop otherwise. So for this set of governing elites, if there is a free market and if there is a stateless society, what exactly are they going to be governing? Because like business elites, like really being like not to sound like one of the disputes why I'm right wing. One of the disputes I have with the left is if you are reasonably conscious about and conscientious or responsible, having authority is actually a minor burden insofar as, like if you take skin in the game seriously, if things go well, you get the praise. If things go poorly, you get the blame. So like I'm not of this sort of like, this sort of rah, like people make bad decisions, and not just like, if you're a business owner, you have to buy, let's say you have to buy product A or product B to resell. It could wind up that product A was just either for bad market reasons or, made improperly or so forth, or you have to hire somebody and they just turn out bad. That decision is now on you. It's like, there's a statement I heard in political science class that oftentimes, like they put the terrorists, put your biggest critics in charge of the organization from time to time, so they know what it's like to be the head of the organization. Now, in this freed market, what would elites actually be deciding on? Like the actual decisions of most businesses are kind of either boring or anodyne, as I think is a good word. And they also come with like responsibility / costs if you either make the wrong decision or you make a decision that's not as good. Like you just think of a vanilla example. If you're hiking in the woods, you don't exactly know where you're going, but you could go here, you might get there. Or let's say you're driving, the GPS recommends different routes. You have to make a choice of those routes. Those choices are like you don't ask the governing elite. You make the decision based on the factors you have now, so to speak. So like the fact that Mitch McConnell or whoever, Lindsey Graham or Keir Starmer, is even allowed to make decisions on stuff is to some extent the problem. Like, or even allowed to, like, the fact that bombing Iran itself is allowed to be a decision that's allowed is like part of the problem. I would think in a freed market, you're not having debate over, should we bomb them back into starvation? That should not even be a thing. We don't have debates over whether we should, pillage a society for, its resources and slaves. But in some sense, we still do that, just in this sort of weird, indirect manner. So like actual family elites and actual government elites in some sort in honest organizations tend to make very lame as in not that exciting, or if they are exciting, they're consequentially exciting, in the sense that like things could go terribly wrong if you make, or at least wrong in the sense that the business could fail, or your church could fail, or your party or whatever could fail. Like, so like what kind of decisions would they actually be making, and like would the laws, so to speak, change, or and this goes back to my pure point here, like, or the laws just going to be like remain the same, just maybe slight variations and updates for technology or changing circumstances. What do you make of this point, Swithin?
Well, it depends on the particular position. If you're going to say my ideal one, I mean, I think basically so what would they do? So what would they do? They would just determine the content of the law. That was it. Now, then the question is, well, which laws? Well, that's going to depend on which ones they pick. But the ideal one would be basically that there's, well, taking a broad natural law position, there are a bunch of laws which are just, and those are ones you uphold. Then there might be edge cases as to how to apply a law, and then maybe different arbitrators would give different views on it, and there needs to be clarification. So in a sense, you could say it functions a little bit like the Supreme Court, except that they're not trying to exegete the Constitution. It's more of a case of, well, what do we think is just? And that's it. So these governing elites, even though you might think it's a, I'm using some governing, I'm implying they're doing a lot of stuff. They're probably not. I mean, how frequently they would meet is probably very small in that. But the thing is, they're just there to set up the rules of the game. Now, they might do other things in other capacities. So if you do this, they're probably going to have lots of they're probably going to be from relatively wealthy backgrounds, or currently very wealthy. They're probably going to have a lot of social status in society. They could well be an arbitrator or judge themselves. But that would be in other capacities than the capacity strictly as a their function in the, as it were, the Supreme Council, the governing elite. When it comes to a market thing, I mean, and again, this is the idea one I have is that, you know, you would have these on relatively small areas, again, to provide exit. So it's a little bit like a market. But I suppose the ideal system, in a sense, you could say this is kind of like the ideal Protestant position, or at least the ideal non-Episcopalian position, which is that all the political communities have the same sort of theology, but that they are independent of each other, and if they want to do something different, they could, but they don't. I suppose that would be the sort of the ultimate position, the ideal position. Now you could say, well, then there's no choice. Well, yeah, fine, but there is at least sort of an independent. I mean, I suppose insofar as all land hasn't been just the acquired, then you could always create your own. I mean, then because a lot of the tricky discussion here is about legitimate land ownership, because it's not immediately obvious what counts as legitimate land ownership. So yeah, so the governing elite in this is governing. I mean, they're not really in the ideal situation doing very much. They're just upholding and continuing, and they're just providing the baseline to go, yeah, okay, we know because this is they're upholding this. And now, how much these laws would be, I'm not sure. Stephen Kinsella, he's a fan of the civil law. Points to sort of like Louisiana of having a codified law thing of like 1,500 words, maybe be less. It depends on the particular interplay between how arbitration wants to work along with this. Maybe you want a smaller one done by the Supreme Council and the rest sort of like common law built on, like a hybrid system of like a civil court, civil law position and a common law position. I don't know, but in principle, especially when the laws have like basically been agreed to begin with and then modified, probably not very much.
I guess the question then it becomes how to stop these people from just constructing a state, or is this already a state and you're just
It depends what you mean by a state. Given my definition of a state, it's not, because they haven't monopolized arbitration. They're not preventing other people from providing judicial services to say this guy's guilty, this guy's innocent, or not guilty. So he hasn't stopped them from doing that. And so per my definition of a state, that's not a state. So now you could say my definition of state is wrong, but I think it's at least consistent with my usage. Go on.
You're right to say it depends on the just acquisition of property. So if party A has a just acquisition of property theory 1, we'll say theory A, and party B just happens to have a just acquisition theory B. One is, let's say, just one is use and continued use, and one is one-time use. And party B says that party A is ruling unjustly. How does this dispute play out? Let's say you owned a piece of land, but you didn't use it for 200 years, and party B, quote unquote, homesteads it. This is a very idealized example to some extent, to try to get at the nature of it here. But like if you ask the Bredonists and the sort of left Lockeans to some extent, they'll argue, well, we also agree with property. We just agree that property is unjust. And if you ask the Hoppe of the what Marx gets right, he's very much in agreement with Kevin Carson and others. Now, Hoppe has a differing theory of like elites and stuff like that. But like in your example, A has A theory and B has B theory. If the governing elites decide one way or another, what like in some sense, because it's land, they can't easily leave. So in some sense, I would argue that they are involuntarily consenting to an impure or disputed theory of justice. Am I describing this incorrectly?
Yeah, of course. But as I said, I mean, all laws are going to go against your will at some point anyway. I just don't see any alternative. I mean, even in contract law, that's true, at least to some extent. So yeah, I mean, this is going to happen. I mean, what's going to happen? What's going to prevent them from becoming a state? That's difficult. I mean, that's the hardest question. I think rather than thinking about how it could even practically run, it's how do you prevent the people from turning it into a state and start systemizing effects. And also, just to note, the reason I'm being very particular in my definition of state is I wanted to distinguish a state from just crime, because a guy who steals something from or builds your house isn't the state. No, I mean, you could say he is, but that's just not what people, that's not the way people relate to it. That's why you have the aspect of legitimacy, hence with the 5-person example of what the minimal state looks like. And when I say the minimal state here, I'm not saying minimalism, I'm saying what minimally would be required to have a state in the way in which I'm describing it. Yeah, I mean, you can't, I mean, so I think elites, go on.
Brilliant point to say that you're distinguishing just like petty crime from like what anti-war types and anti-state types call state crime. There's a brilliant point in distinguishing what like the legitimacy point, but like the legitimacy point is itself a fiction. Is like, well, it's a fiction that some people see, but we are forced to actually believe in that fiction. So when the police kidnap you for, which in a sense they're kidnapping you, enforcing an unjust law, they're in some sense are violating your will unjustly. So like in theory they're actually worse than a criminal, because like, except maybe, well, even in Britain you're allowed to somewhat defend yourself against, it's not that bad yet, but like especially in America, like if I would rather be robbed by actual robbers. I mean, this makes me very left wing, insofar as like it is the case that like the FBI, other groups just take more people than. I mean, I don't have Ring doorbell cameras or anything. I shouldn't say that, but like because to me, I'm more like I don't want to be surveilled by like a crypto public company. I am more afraid of, for the most part. In third world countries, it might be, or failed societies, it might be different. But like in my own society, I am more afraid of, for the most part, the state than I am of private criminals. Lou Rockwell agrees. So that brilliant point to separate the two. But like, if you get rid of the legitimacy point, if you get rid of the legitimacy like shield, then what like. Then what's to stop these people from becoming criminals with a privileged position? I guess it's ideology, or I guess it's other. I mean, Burnham makes the point that the only thing that can check power is other power, and this makes the point in Machiavellians and Defenders of Freedom. I would argue that it's a mixture of exit as well as other rights protection agencies that can say, no, actually, these elites are enforcing these things unjustly. In the same way that the real way to make a restaurant better is not to reform the restaurant, it's to open another restaurant and beat them. And I think in a freed market, you can do that. And not only do it, you can do it well. So in that regard, that to me is the hope. But I think unlike where different restaurants, you get different like tastes for different folks, like maybe different people have different views on what counts as good food. The problem of different people have different views of laws. This is a more primary level dispute, which that to me is both the promise and the blind spot of anarchism. It could be that you just need a brutal despot just to set the law is, so you don't get too much insanity. It could be. I mean, that's the case that the minarchists make. But the legitimacy point, how you distinguish between, that's a brilliant point. But if you take away the legitimacy, which people like Hoppe do, I mean, Hoppe is the one, unlike the David Friedman types and Rothbard, they like to hate the state with their belly. They like to throw insults at them. They like to call them a bunch of crooks. Hoppe was critical of Ron Paul, and now Hoppe's critical of Javier Milei too, which is hilarious. So like that's my point. You take away the legitimacy point. It is just crime. But then how does this distinguish from just like I want to make an appeal to the Foucault versus Chomsky debate. I don't want to do it because I think it's cliche, but like there is a sense in which is justice is justice merely just what the powerful says as what is right and wrong, and how does this relate to anarchism? Well, I would say it relates to anarchism because in our current society we might have some views of justice, but then I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't really have a well-developed theory on this, but I would say I'm a hopeful anarchist in the sense that I'm hopeful, but I am very much a pessimist on the sense that if we have to rely on politicians or kings for the laws, then to both interpret and enforce the laws, then I think we're just like to some extent screwed to some mild to maximum form of despotism or tyranny. That'd be my somewhat closing comment here, Swithin.
The point I made about legitimacy, I wasn't saying that the state was legitimate. I was saying that some people think that it is. So if the police take you away and put you in a box, other people aren't going to go, oh, that was bad. Maybe we should try and help him get him out. All I'm saying is so they won't do that when the police do it. But if I come with a big white van and chuck you in the back, they might. That's all I mean by legitimacy. I'm not saying that people think they're divine or that there is genuine legitimacy as in there's
people in a way do think the state they wouldn't use that word, but like they do in a way think the state is allowed to do that. And if they don't, even if they don't think it, the state will do it.
That's precisely the point. That's precisely the point. So when I'm saying legitimacy, I'm not saying it's legitimate or there's a particular mechanism. It's just the way people relate to it. That's what that's how they treat it, and that's why it's different. And so the position is saying you've got to distinguish the law creation and the enforcement of it. And the way I'm describing it, I'm not saying that they are enforcing it directly. I'm not saying that they're part of any like restitution agencies, or that they're necessarily as part of a Supreme Council actually providing arbitration services. They are just providing the legal code on which people can freely choose different arbitrators. But in some cases, they're going to have to be forced to go to one because maybe someone will abscond. And maybe unless you want to declare them outlaw, you're going to then you're going to like put them in a box to make sure they don't escape. And you're going to try them, and then maybe they're going to come out, maybe they're free. But that's what's going to have to happen unless you're going to have outlawry, or you're going to, have a situation where nobody's actually going to enforce any law anyway. Now, you could say, but even in that case, yes, you're right, that even if you had the organization that determined the content of the law, how are you going to stop them from, changing the content of the law to say, well, the law actually is sort of dual natured, that only the people we say you can go to for justice you can actually go for justice. What's stopping them to do that? You're right, ideology. It's basically what the elites think is good. So you need to look on what happens to the type of person who would end up in the governing elite defined as people as part of the sort of Supreme Council in this idea, or other terms are fine, and how they come to the views that they come to, and altering that is what's going to matter. Plus, as I say, other groups that are going to sort of prevent them from exercising their will, and that's the way you're going to be able to try and to keep a situation, stop them from exploiting it. Because even if you started with Rothbardistan, then there's no necessary reason why it would remain in Rothbardistan. So. Yeah, I just think that's just a problem that you're going to have, and I think the position I've outlined is entirely consistent with a Rothbardian position. And insofar as Rothbard is an anarchist, then that's an anarchist. It's consistent with anarchism, unless you want to define anarchism in a different way. Could well be the case that the left anarchist would say that my position on man is perfectible, and so therefore there's going to be no disputes or whatever, and so therefore we don't need this thing to take place. But these sort of laws to be determined and enforced and sort of foisted on people. But as far as that's the case, it's good. Yeah, I don't see any alternative.
That's roughly my final comment there, Swithin. If you want to end it, I mean, I don't have any more comments. I would say I'm a hopeful anarchist in the sense that I'm hopeful that it could work, but I do see the strength of the case that you might just need to involuntarily force upon people the law. But like the point about the legitimacy is great, but I think a lot of your conservative friends sometimes probably get either view libertarianism as utopian or view libertarians as being degenerate by undermining authority of the state. So like calling the state a group of gangs and thieves, robbers, which is what the Hoppians and Rothbardians do, which I agree. But like that's like now I would make an appeal and say, well, I'm actually defending the actual order by getting rid of these phony ordering gangs by defending actual order. So that would be my response to the conservatives who call libertarians underminers in that sense. But that would be my point, that the state's undermining. But I'm a hopeful anarchist.
Do you think my definition of the state is correct?
I think it's good enough, but I don't like. This is the nature of like, you know, the point is not just to convince me. You have to convince everyone.
Well, no, because of the way you're speaking, it's almost as if, and this is perfectly legitimate use of words, is that the position I've outlined is somehow statist. Now, you fine, call me a statist. I don't care. That's fine. But the way you seem to think that this is enforcing on people and this is state-like or statist. Am I interpreting you correctly?
It's not statist in the way that the U.S. government or the British state is statist, but I think it's statist in the ways in which some anarchists might view it as statist. And whether
would you consider it statist?
Would I view it as statist? It's rather hard to say. Like I'm opposed to what I can see in the actual existing state, but I'm not. But like it's like the people say, well, let's just say such and such is the case. It's like Peter Van Inwood has a statement: all hypotheticals, all counterfactuals are both true and false. You know, so like to some extent, your Supreme Council is your definition of the state is like it's so idealized. Like I don't view when the police come to get.
Why is my definition idealized? I've just provided what I think is a very clear thing to distinguish the state from non-state based on the tradition of monopoly of law. How is it idealized? I don't see how it's idealized.
The people who the point about third parties agreeing to it. That's where I think the error lies.
Hang on. You
have the 5 people.
I have 5 people, and there's one person who thinks that the 4th person should be the only person the other 3 can go to. I don't. In what sense is that idealized? Is that idealized in the sense of like ethically idealized, or is it idealized in the sense that where is there a case where everyone or where people agree in this? Where's there ever a case where people all? I mean, when philosophers, where's it all? I don't see where I've said all. I've literally said 5 people. I said 2 people have a dispute. They want to go to a 3rd guy for arbitration. The 4th guy says no, you've got to go to me, and the 5th person says yeah, you should go to the 4th guy. I don't see how that's like. In what sense is that idealized?
All right, it's not idealized. It's the perfect definition. I think defining the state is not like defining a chair. Okay, a chair is a thing with X number of legs and a platform to sit upon. Now, whether a rock that's shaped like a chair is a chair, I don't know. But like a chair is an easily definable thing. I spent a year and a half in college defining democracy, basically, because if you combine a democracy, you basically like that's the word of our day. And we had an episode in Word Salad, and one of the words you want to talk about was democracy. And democracies are deeply rooted to states. You know, when we're talking about democracies, we're not talking about 5 friends going out to lunch, debating, choosing where to go out to lunch. We're talking about like democracy as in parliament, or as in, you know, the democracy is expressed in early churches, democracies and stuff like that. That's what people are talking about democracy. But like North Korea also has a democracy. So, like, when you talk about all wars that just don't have some easy physical thing to point to me, are just inherently disputed. Like, I mean, this is why I had the episode about Rick Brammer.
They don't have stipulated definitions. I've just given a stipulated definition of what constitutes the state. Now, given the way that you generally conceive of the state, and also this is a minimally strong state. I mean, this state probably would, depending on the individual, this is just like the weakest possible state. That's the only way of describing it. So that you can go from state and non-state. I mean, if you can't define the differences, how can you declare yourself an anarchist if you don't even know what the state is?
How could I? Well, I would say, for one thing, the state identifies itself as the government. I mean, government and state are synonymous. So, like, one way to find a state is we declare ourselves a government. I mean, the U.S. government clearly views itself as the government. The police view themselves as part of the government. It's on their paychecks. It's on their contracts. I
have no idea what your position is. I simply don't know.
You're correct.
You're saying it's hopeful. Hopeful of what? To have what position? I don't know what.
I would say I'm hopeful that we can get justice implemented by the free market. That would be my.
But what does that even mean?
I don't know. Kinsella was asked similar. Kinsella was asked similar questions, and he refused to speculate on the future. Kinsella was asked from. I don't have a perfect memory on every podcast I listen to.
No. Kinsella says that all the time, and it's pathetic. Like you've got to have at least some idea, rather than because what does the free market in? Because the thing is that what counts as a free market in legal services? What does it even mean?
Well, see, I'm in that regard. I'm taking from Kinsella in that regard, because I like Kinsella's empty summit, so to speak, or placeholder. Like, rather than filling it with something, you just have a placeholder. Like recently the 4th of July happened, and someone had on libertarianism, the UK one, they had an article like making fun of the American Revolution, which I'm not going to say it got me annoyed, because I don't really get annoyed in that sense when people, but like all I could think about was the English Civil War. Like, you guys did it too. And that's why actually when you and Rick were talking about it. And so I was like, of course the American Revolution decayed into the U.S. Constitution, which in turn decayed into like the Lincoln administration and so on and so on. Of course it did. But like the Rothbardians do make the point that like, well, it started out kind of pure, and Jeffrey Hummel make the point that the American Revolution was in some sense necessary. So you call what Kinsella does as pathetic when he won't talk about the future. But like the problem with that is we've done a lot of stuff. We humans, libertarians and other groups and libertarian-like groups have done a lot of stuff, and things have just turned out badly. The managerial state, for the most part, has marched a la untrampled in most societies, in some societies more than others, for the past 200 years or so. Basically unchecked. Like I mean, like we have we have the Fourth Amendment in the United States. Yet on the other hand, we have no such thing as like the police have all sorts of takings clauses and Terry stops and so forth. It's a joke. We have the Second Amendment, but then we have all sorts of other things that are so to me, the managerial state has just basically marched unchecked, and it continues to march unchecked into the future. Like we had the COVID, it was a white pill or a black pill. And I think I in some areas it was a white pill, in some areas it was a black pill. But in many areas it's just an outright black pill. Like, businesses got ruined, education got stopped, all sorts of things. The unjust got richer. So like I'm in that sense am black pilled about the future in that regard.
But how, I don't see what this has to do with
your
what
definition.
It even look like, even in embryo. I'm not saying in my position I'm providing a detailed outworking. All I'm saying is, well, a free market in legal services just is that you can't stop somebody So if two parties agree to have someone to arbitrate, that their ruling is not treated as illegitimate, it's not. It's just because of who produced it, because that's essentially what happens in the status position, and that is essentially how I'm saying a free market in legal services works. I mean, that's a slither, but it's at least something to work from. If you don't have anything to work from, you have no idea what it would look like.
So, okay, then since you publicly say that Kinsella is pathetic for doing that, then I fully assent to your definition, because I am somewhat taking this from Kinsella, who is to some extent a natural elite in libertarian circles. Hoppe doesn't speak as much, I think, ex ante or whatever. Hoppe doesn't speak as much. Hoppe speaks rarely about other topics than so, like, since like the person who's done that, held that position, I would take from Kinsella. So I think you do have a good definition then. But like getting it implemented, or getting everyone else to agree to it, I think would be more difficult.
It's not about getting, okay, so but there's two different things. There's what my position is of how it could run, and then just what the state is. It's two completely separate questions. Because under this position, you can have loads of different. You could have non-state Islamic republics that are perfectly consistent, because all it states is whatever the law that is decided, but then there's no legal restriction on who can pronounce in disputes. So there's a huge difference between what the state is and how I think you can best operate in the absence of a state. I think they're two separate things. So unless you're thinking that somehow the definition of the state and the ideal are somehow co-intertwined.
I do think the definition of the state and the ideal are in some sense
How?
So your definition of the state is these five people. In particular, it's the fourth person and the fifth person that really are really like if we just existed in the proverbial state of nature, or we existed on a island, okay, okay, and you and I had a dispute, and there was no other people around, okay, and we evolved this dispute. We instead of fighting, we use argumentation ethics to solve this dispute, okay? Then, like, what you really do is you're just really having an argument, and then, like, whoever wins the argument wins the whatever is at stake, correct? Are you there?
Or you hit each other over the head.
Or you hit each other over in the head. I mean, I think the state, in some sense, is more like hitting people over the head with this sort of ideological apparatus that says, well, actually, we should hit you over the head, or something like that. And Hoppe agrees with me, too. I mean, I take this from Hoppe. Like, Hoppe's the one who has the radical rhetoric, and Hoppe and Rothbard criticized David Friedman. Rothbard criticized David Friedman for not hating the state. And Friedman responded to Rothbard, well, he liked to do his arguing with his head, not his belly. He didn't hate it in his belly. So so the point about legitimacy, it is just crime. I view the state as a crime gang with legitimacy. That would be my definition of the state.
So under that view, then, you're basically saying that you cannot then by definition have a non-libertarian stateless position.
Yes,
that's fine, but I just didn't understand what your position was.
But here's the thing. I think that is, in the very minor sense, imperial. Like I am making rules for all other people at all other times by saying that, which I think is hubristic to do. But I do think there, you can't have, like, this is Walter Block's about, like, you can't sell yourself into slavery, like the can you sell yourself into slavery debate. And now maybe you can do it for 10 minutes, like maybe, like, I don't know, maybe you can do it, maybe there's a time limit where it's legitimate you can do, and this gets into continuum problems. Like, Walter Block would bring up, like, I don't know, sadomasochism or some, like, things like that, or like, sure. But like, I do think that you can't have non-libertarian societies because they're just unjust laws. I would say libertarian laws and just laws are the same thing. That'd be my viewpoint. That's where I would rest. States are just crime gangs.
But the thing is, I just don't see how then you can distinguish just between crime and the state. You're just going to have a continuum problem, and I just don't think that does justice to the nature of the state, what the state does historically, how it arose, how it functions. It's simply not just crime, but basically you're just saying it's crime.
I do think it's just crime. I mean,
you can have that, but I mean, that doesn't seem to do justice to how the state operates, how it's different from even organized crime.
Well, I would say that's like, FDR made it illegal to own gold over X amount in 1932. That's how you got the Federal Reserve. You didn't get the Federal Reserve because people say, wouldn't it be a great idea? Let's all agree to give up. No, I mean, and people were tried. People were literally tried for owning gold. Like, and the only reason the state couldn't enforce that because it had customs and port authorities, and they were given to, like, various acts starting the Lincoln administration. They had the rules of the books to make this law real. No one agreed to the Federal Reserve. No one. I mean, I visited Jekyll Island with my father. I mean, basically, the 12 richest families in the United States had a vacation destination, a private island off the coast of Georgia. And they had the home that was drawn up. And actually, another guy on the tour group we had, who's also, like, looks like me, probably thinks like me, is probably in the sort of, like, lunatic part, asked the question, was this the place? And yeah, that's where the Federal Reserve started, on a vacation home of the elite off of, the coast of Georgia. The Goodyears, the Rockefellers. No one agreed. So that's just, to me, that's just thievery. The fact that other people don't see it as thievery is part of the problem. But that's I mean, to me, like, what you're saying is like, you to some extent are believing the legitimacy rhetoric because other people believe the legitimacy rhetoric.
I'm explaining how they behave, and they behave differently towards the organization because they believe it to be legitimate in some form.
I would say, it is
crime, and I'm not saying the state doesn't engage in crime. Of course it does, but if we're going to distinguish, I just don't see how. I mean, for how it does and how it operates, it's just not like a regular group of people.
Yes, but it is just like, I mean, if you observe county governments on, like, again, I have friends who have served in the city council. If you observe county governments who have very little power over, like, the federal, they had no power over that, or school boards, how they operate, or school districts, public school districts in America, they operate just like any other organization. They're not special. They just have special privileges. They're given special.
People relate to them that matters, and specifically what they do.
If I could change anything, it's to change people's relationships. So in my rhetoric, I think Hoppe is correct to call them a gang of crooks, thieves, and whatever. I think he's correct to call them that, not to call them, well, because other people treat them specially, we're going to treat them specially. No, I mean, whether Goodyear is doing whether Goodyear is doing a murder and assassination, or whatever gang, Tren de Agua or whatever, it's the same thing. Now, maybe there are differences. Look, there are differences in the sense that states do operate differently than gangs, but in some sense, gangs have restrictions that states don't have. Gangs don't have unlimited money like the United States has near unlimited money. Like, the United States has near unlimited money to do certain things. So, like, actually, your local gang down the street does run, let's say you live in a city and you have there's a gang there. And Lou Rockwell likes to talk about how, like, the gangs used to make New York might have been safer before. So even there, it's hard to distinguish between gangs and actual existing states. And we did an episode with Keith Preston, and Keith Preston was very cagey because I made the point, and Whitney Webb makes this point, that the CIA basically was born out of organized crime in the second half of World War II. Like, the literal CIA got in bed with literal gangsters, literal Italian gangsters, and they started an organization. That's how they got all these German scientists and stuff into the United States and vice versa, and did treaties. So, like, the actual state does actual deals with gangsters. If you watch the movie American Made with Tom Cruise, which is apocryphal but basically true, like, the state and the gangs operate shoe and glove all the time to run. Bill Clinton is a gangster. The fact that other people view him as, like, a saintly person, I don't know. Actually, no one believes him as a saintly person. But, like, to me, because other people are viewing it as legitimate, you're saying it's legitimate, which, sure, I do think they do operate on some level differently. But if you look deeply at a school board or the governor, how the governorship of Arkansas works, then I think they actually operate, like all other human organizations. That's why I think people like Pareto and Mosca and others are such interesting sociologists and so important to libertarianism. That'd be my comment towards you.
Like, I agree that they engage in crime. Yeah, sure. And also, it can be the case that organized crime can become states. It's true. Per my definition, they can easily prevent you from going for somebody else for justice, and then so they become a state. Fine, they do in the minimal sense. Remember, this definition of state is purely the minimal possible definition of a state. That's the whole point. But it seems to me, from your position, to anarchism to be true, there can be no crime.
Well, there can be crime, but people have to accept. People have to, like, again, you could say this is laughable, but, like, it sort of happens. It sort of sometimes happens where, let's say you hit your brother, okay? And you agreed, I shouldn't have hit my brother, so I'm going to go out of my way. I'm going to make the situation with my brother right. Okay, so I'm going to, pay compensation or hit myself. In a sense, you've solved, there was crime, but you solved the crime amongst yourselves. You didn't appeal to a third party necessarily. You came to now. This could only exist amongst equals. It could be that it only exists amongst equals in that regard. So you can't, Todd Lewis likes to say, children and the elderly are a problem for libertarians. I would say they're a problem for any legal ethical system. I think it's a problem that it's a problem that 14-year-olds can get the death penalty, or it's a problem they can't get the death penalty. Many people who are, like, pro-children want it both ways, and you and I agree on that point, that people are schizophrenic when it comes to that. But the thing is, I would say that you'd have to, I don't know, maybe that is utopian, but then crime would have to be, like, either self-enforced, or everyone around you has to agree that, like, we're not going to do business with them, or we're not going to talk to them.
Okay, so what you're saying is so you either agree yourself, or the only punishment is things that you do which are consistent with negative rights, and so you just treat them like you treat anybody, but everyone creates a boycott. They refuse to trade with you, etc. They refuse to let you in their hotels or whatever, and effectively you become an outcast. And is that the only legitimate punishment? Then you might assent to the actual punishment. So one of the weird twisted senses of the state, which I think is actually just, is you could argue, and I've seen this in movies, especially Western movies, the jail protects the thief from the mob of people outdoors. So if you want to try to liberalize the state, make the state, the jail protects the thief from the angry mob outside door that you want to go to jail, so that you can actually get a fair trial
from them. So that could be the case. But then the problem for me is that the mob itself is the problem in that regard. So like it could be that you get a lesser punishment. I mean, like oftentimes when like Derek Chauvin, for example, bring up an example. Like people wanted to kill that guy, right? Right? People wanted to tear that guy from limb to limb. Leftists wanted to tear that guy limb to limb. Like he was just like on one level he was like, I mean, that's the problem. He was doing his job, and his job was to do the job of the state. And I just think the job of the state, for the most part, is crime. If the job of this, if it's justice, then anyone should be able to do it, or anyone who's able to do it, to do it. That would be my. So when it comes to legal, okay, so your fourth and fifth person are the areas of where agreement. So 1 and 2, like the persons who are having a disagreement, are the areas, like if we were on a Robinson Crusoe situation and you just had 2 people having a disagreement and you agreed not to fight, and just hit each other over the head, to solve the problem. Then like the other person would have to assent voluntarily to the thing in that regard. So you need an enforcement body, I think, to make it a state too, and it has to be effective, because you get failed states too. Failed states are some of the most interesting things to look at, like or failing states. For example, in the interwar period between the 2 wars, a lot of the states in Eastern Europe that were set up were basically, they had competing states, and after the post they had various, it wasn't clear who exactly was the state. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Purge, but for 1 day a year they make crime
legal. Yeah, I've seen it. I know it.
The premise is the movie is low, so it's like I wouldn't, even if crime was legal, I wouldn't shoot my mother or anybody in my family. Okay, I wouldn't do that. But like maybe people would come and shoot me. I don't know. Maybe they would shoot. So like to me, if the state, like if the state doesn't exist, would you shoot your mother? I would assume no. Hopefully not. I wouldn't. I don't think you would. But like the same thing. But I do think if someone shot Lindsey Graham, since he's dead, I can say that, the NSA. I don't think it would be a tragedy in the current existing society. Like if I did not have any tears for the death of Lindsey Graham. Like I don't think he created order. I don't think he created anything good. I would just call him a criminal. I mean, I have more sympathy for the Luigi, and this is going to hate, some of your conservative friends aren't going to like me for saying that. I have more sympathy for the Luigi or the Juan than I do of Lindsey Graham. I basically both view them as criminals. And maybe that's a failing of me, but that's my outlook. Maybe that makes me left wing, but I would just say that's just justice. If justice exists, that's just justice. So,
I think your position is more clear than Kinsella's now. So if I get your position correct, anarchism is where people consent to their punishment because they hate being ostracized and basically being outcasts of society. So they'll voluntarily agree to go, well, basically voluntarily, but they would prefer the situation where they're in society than when they're not. And so then we'll agree to whatever punishment, or, well, the punishment that maybe a third party has rendered. Is that fair? And
yes, that's entirely fair.
There we go. Perfect. Got that.
40 minutes later.
Excellent. We got there. I kind of thought you have an idea. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah, but see, you have to force me. You have to with the threat of outcasting. you have to drag me to it. But see, I voluntarily agreed to get dragged there.
Excellent. Well, that's fine. Well, I think we've gone on long. I think this is our record, but I think this was a very useful episode because what the state is and what the state isn't, and what law is and what it's not, and what you agree to and what you don't agree to is essential. And
Alex Jones went for 4 hours and 40 minutes, so we still have 3 hours to go.
That's true. Go get a drink and we'll do round 2. Do you have any final comments or questions?
No.
Excellent. Well, everybody, if you could say to the end, well done. If you have any final comments or questions, final comment. If you have any questions you want to ask, please contact us at Mindcrime Liberty Show at gmail.com. Share this with your friends and family, and I will get my outro correct in the next episode. Goodbye.